Well, it's great to be here and to get a chance to share with you. I just want to say thanks to Pastor Randy especially. I think the last time I preached was last summer, and we were in a very different place in the life of the church, not knowing who the future pastor or pastors would be. And so this summer it feels a little bit different as we look forward to the coming of our pastors in just a few months. And thanks to the elders also for giving me the chance to preach. It's fun to get a chance to share with you something that's on my heart, something that I've been thinking about, and especially as I interact with students, something that they often think about. Now, as we begin talking about Isaiah 27, I want to ask you to think about how you describe experiences that are really hard to describe to somebody else. Like, have you ever had one of these moments where you had an experience that you wanted to try to explain to somebody else, but you struggled to come up with the words? Right, maybe you're walking in the woods somewhere and you see some animal that's massive. Perhaps you think it's Bigfoot and you want to share it with somebody, but words just won't do. Maybe you met somebody that was just this incredible person that you met in a really difficult moment, and you wanted to try to share and describe what they did for you. Right? Maybe it was the nicest, most kindest person you had ever met, or you had some other experience that you struggled to come up with the words to describe it. Right? You felt that normal words just wouldn't do. This is something that I was thinking about a month or two ago as the astronauts on the Artemis were out in outer space beyond the moon. Right? They're orbiting the moon and they're sending images and conversations back to us, trying to describe what it is that they are experiencing. Like, I've been out on a boat in the middle of the ocean before, and it's sort of an awe-inspiring moment. Like, at no land in sight, which feels really strange for me as a land creature, but for them to be in outer space, like, this is something that 99.9% of us will never experience. How do they describe that to the rest of us? Astronauts, what they do is they try to describe what they refer to often as the overview effect. They describe the shift in their awareness when they see this small blue dot right against the background of this black and vast open space. They use metaphors, they use symbols to try to describe for us what they are experiencing, to try to paint a picture with words. And some of the astronauts, they describe the Earth that they see from so far away as a fragile ball of life, right? Trying to capture the contrast between the vibrant Earth compared to the dark and lifeless void of space. Others have described it as a precious blue marble, which feels really strange to me because a marble is tiny. And the Earth certainly doesn't feel tiny to me, but as they look at it from so far away, it certainly does to them. Others have said it was like escaping Plato's cave. Another said it was an explosion of awareness, trying to emphasize this radical shift in understanding that takes place when you see the Earth from so far away. Now, in addition to using metaphorical language or symbolic images to explain personal experiences, people often use, or try anyway, to use symbolic or metaphorical language to explain theological concepts. Like, theology is frankly hard. Try explaining the Trinity to somebody. Like, God is simultaneously three in one. And what the average person typically does is they try to use symbols or metaphors. Perhaps you've heard the egg metaphor used to explain the Trinity, or maybe the one with H2O, right? Water, ice, and steam. Now, no doubt in using those metaphors, you're likely committing some sort of heresy. I'll defer to others in the congregation to tell us. But I sympathize to a certain extent with what you're trying to do. You're trying to take a really hard concept and explain it to somebody using words or images, symbols that they might understand. This is something the Bible does all the time, right? It uses symbols, it uses images to help us grasp these really difficult concepts, ones that we struggle to explain or understand, because they want us to tangibly understand what's taking place. And so the Bible does this. It explains God, for example. But the topic that I want to talk about today is the topic of evil, or theodicy. Like, how do we explain the presence of evil in the world? And how do we explain what God is going to do with evil, with suffering in the world as we experience it? Right? We know that there's a good God in heaven, and yet we look at the world and we know it's broken. We know it's fallen. How do we describe that to others who are struggling with the same thing? Now, this is something that is on my heart because it's rare that a semester goes by when I don't have a student come into my office and say, I'm really struggling with the problem of evil. I don't know what to do with it. It doesn't make sense to me that I believe in a good God in heaven, and yet I experience sickness and warfare and darkness. Right? The student wanted to know why people in the world are starving, why there are wars raging. They want to know why tornadoes rip through towns and villages, indiscriminately killing people. They want to know why the infant mortality rate still isn't zero. Why does this happen? Now, the Bible certainly addresses the presence of evil in several different ways, but one of the ways it does so is by using this symbolic language. Right? It uses language that makes the topic easier for us to picture, right? Providing visual images of evil and the world's chaos in a way that makes it easier for us to understand. It at times gives evil a body, it at times gives this chaos a face. And I think what the Bible is doing is it recognizing that we have these anxieties, we have these fears about so many things in life. Things like death, like sickness, natural disasters. And the symbolic language that we find in the Bible is trying to make us understand why it's there and what God is going to do about it. It recognizes these are real experiences and it wants to help us resolve these anxieties and these fears we have about the world we live in. Now, before getting to our passage back to Isaiah 27, I want to help you recognize that this is something that is done, that we do as societies all the time. We recognize this and we project these fears and these anxieties. And every generation has these fears, anxieties that sometimes change. They're a little bit different. But one of the ways that generally societies will deal with some of these fears and anxieties is through monster literature or monster movies. Like, it's this reality that we project monsters on the screen to portray some of our fears and anxieties. And so, yes, that is right. We're going to talk about monsters today. So if you're one that loves monster books, literature like Frankenstein, or movies like Godzilla, then you're going to be happy about the message today. If you're not one that typically loves these monster books or movies, then I want to show you this is not some juvenile topic. That even these, in a way, are doing theology. Right, the word itself, monster, actually comes from the Latin monstrum, which is from the verb monstrare, to show or to reveal. Like, the monsters are showing or revealing society's fears and anxieties. This is what they're doing. They're exploring them, explaining them, and helping us resolve them. Right, think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There's several fears that it reveals. I'll only talk about a couple of them. Right, the first, this fear of unchecked scientific progress. This fear revolving around humans trying to play God. Another fear that we see explored in Frankenstein is that Victor, the scientist, is creating life from dead matter, essentially removing the need for natural methods of reproduction to create a male body. One UCLA professor said, quote, "If he had succeeded, you wouldn't need women anymore," Shelley was implying. "You could eliminate the need for female wombs." That's one of the implicit horrors of her book, a male-driven desire to control and exploit the secrets of Mother Nature. Or you could think of the fears and anxieties explored by that famous monster Godzilla. About 33 of those Godzilla movies out there. And there's no doubt that throughout its history, the Godzilla movies, they've reflected specifically the island nation of Japan's fears. Right? The first, the 1954 film, is a symbol of post-World War II nuclear trauma and the dropping of the atomic bombs. The 1984 version of Godzilla was related to anxieties and fears about the Cold War. The 1999 version shifted from fears of nuclear disaster to fears of corporate technological overreach as it dealt with the birth and the growth of the internet. The 2016 version of the never-dying Godzilla patterned itself after the earthquake and the tsunami that led to the Fukushima disaster. Then, if you were to go to the American version of all of these movies, they reflect different fears, different anxieties that each of these cultures has. We could get into children's movies too, like Monsters, Inc. Certainly that represents a fear that children have. It's an anxiety that it tries to help people work through. We do this too with political discussions, with political enemies. We use monster images and language to talk about them. During World War II, typically the Axis powers of Germany and Japan, they're depicted as a two-headed monster coming to destroy the United States, trying to encourage people to get involved in production so they could fend off this monster. And so the monsters in these books, these movies, these political conversations, they're dealing with these anomalies in the world, the well-ordered world that we think should be there. Because we have expectations about how the world should run. We think that it should be ordered. And the monsters represent these times when that order is broken. It's a recognition that something that should be outside has gotten inside. Tim Beale, who writes a book on this, says this: "The monster is that which invades one's sense of personal, social, or cosmic order and security. They stand for what endangers one's sense of at-homeness." Now, I'm not sure if it surprises you or not, but as we're going to talk about today, and as Beale says, the Bible is literally riddled with monsters. Or another commentator discussing the dragon, the monster's, let's say, cousin for today, said that dragons are found all throughout the Bible. The word for dragon in Hebrew tanin or the Greek drakon shows up 35 different times, prominently in books like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Job, and then in Greek, the book of Revelation. Other words for creatures like Leviathan, which we're talking about today, or the Rahav, or the Tehom, or the Behemoth, they show up more than a dozen times. And that's not even mentioning the ones in Daniel or in Revelation that show up over and over again. And so the Bible used this monster imagery long before books like Frankenstein or movies like Godzilla were doing it, to do something similar, to help us work through our fears and our anxieties about things like death and the evil in the world. It's doing theodicy. Now, my guess is that most of us, when we come to passages like Isaiah 27, which talk about this serpent-like thing with multiple heads, or Psalm 74, we're just confused, we ignore them, we're not sure what to do with it. But I think the reality is the Bible uses these monster-like things as one way to explore this question that these students I have are wrestling with, and that we sometimes have as we think about why there is evil in the world, and what will God do about it? Right? We know that God created the world good, even very good as we read in Genesis chapter 1. Right? But the world we live in is full of things like death and sickness and suffering. Like these things certainly threaten our sense of at-homeness. Something is off. We know we are not really at home. We long for earth to be like it is in heaven, as we so often pray and even did this morning. Now, what I've been talking about so far, about the monster representing the outside getting inside, ruining the order of the world, it really reminds me of the way the Bible begins. It begins with God creating humanity, planting a garden, and placing them in it. And all of a sudden, in chapter 3, on the third page of the Bible, shows up this snake. It doesn't give us much about that snake. It just says there is something. And it seems to us that something that we think should be outside has gotten inside. Now, the rest of the Bible certainly gives us details. It really is interesting to me that Genesis never unpacks how the serpent got there, how it got in, why it's talking to Adam and Eve. It's just there. It's similar with a Leviathan. The Bible does not dwell on the origins of these things or the origins of evil. It doesn't dwell on them, perhaps because what matters is redemption and what God is doing with the evil in the world. And perhaps it's saying to us that sometimes the suffering that we experience, the chaos of the world that we see, what matters more than the origins of it, where it came from, is that what God is going to do with it. And this is what Isaiah 27 is going to do on that day as it begins to explain what God will do with the evil, the suffering in the world itself. And so I hope our discussion thus far of monsters, books, movies, etc., has given us a chance now to come to the Leviathan in Isaiah chapter 27, to think of it as a symbol of the evil and the chaos of the world. Now, the first thing I think that we need to realize as we try to understand what in the world this thing is, described as this twisty, gliding serpent, and as either a dragon, as the NRSV translated it, or a monster, as the NIV has it, is the larger context of Isaiah 27. Now, this chapter, Isaiah 27, is part of this block of chapters, Isaiah 24 to 27, which has been deemed by many as this mini-apocalypse. This section of Isaiah has a lot of similarities in that way with the book of Revelation. Now, I don't think it's an apocalypse just because it says it's dealing with the end of the world, but because it's giving us the truth from God's perspective. It reveals, or if you will, it revelates for us, using the image of Leviathan, what God is doing and will do with all that disrupts the goodness of the world itself. And most importantly, in doing so, the text will work to resolve our anxieties related to all the evils of the world, our anxieties that we'll see at the end, especially related to death. Isaiah 24 to 27, these chapters have a very universal perspective as they focus on God's control of the whole world. But they follow on chapters 13 to 23 of Isaiah, which are a series of chapters that deal with these foreign nations, the nations surrounding Israel, nations like Philistia, nations like Moab, nations like Assyria and Babylon. Now, in Old Testament times, these were nations that were constantly threatening the people of Israel and Judah with military action. They were oppressing them over and over, conquering them, and Babylon especially was one to come, to conquer, and to exile the people from their homes. Right? These imperial powers, they besieged, they surrounded Israel's cities. These sieges resulted in famine and disease and far worse. We even read in a book like Lamentations of the horrors of a siege, We read that parents were forced to reflect on, how am I going to survive? They were forced to think about having to eat their dead or dying children just to stay alive. The suffering of ancient Israel was real, and it was drastic. Death was all around them. Right? There's no doubt to me that Isaiah 24 to 27 are thinking about this moment in Israel's history when the outside, something that should be outside has now gotten inside, that invaded their sense of being at home in their land. Right? The order, the structure of their lives is gone, and it's scary because the monster seems to be winning. Like, this is theodicy. This is wrestling with the problem of evil. And they're wondering, what is God going to do about this? And Isaiah 24 to 27 show up after these chapters, helping the people think about what God is going to do about it. They need to be reminded that God has power in the moment when Babylon is winning. They needed to trust in God's ability, and it was really hard to do so. And it's a message for us as well. In moments of tragedy and suffering, how do we trust that God is still on the throne? Now, what's really interesting is that elsewhere in the Bible, it actually talks about these empires as monsters. It uses that same language that we see in some of our political discussions to frame what Babylon is actually doing. Ezekiel talks about the Pharaoh as an oppressive monster in chapter 29, verse 3. When he says, "Thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster that lies in the midst of his streams." The same thing happens in Ezekiel 32 when we read, "Son of man, raise a lamentation over Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him, you consider yourself a lion of the nations, but you are like a monster in the seas." And the one that is most relevant is what Jeremiah does with Babylon as he talks about their king in chapter 51, verse 34. Jeremiah says, "King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon has devoured me. He has crushed me. He has made me an empty vessel. He has swallowed me like a monster." Now, I think in these cases, the monster imagery provided this grounding for Israel to talk about the oppression that they were experiencing. At the hand of these powerful empires, they had no ability to fight back with their military. It gave them a way to visualize, to express their deep-seated anxieties about the world and their place in it. But more importantly, I think it provided a way for them to resolve these anxieties about evil and suffering in the world itself, which is exactly what Isaiah 27:1 does, as it talks about the future destruction of this Leviathan. And so with that in mind, as that context comes to our mind, we can now come more directly to explore, to unveil this monstrous body of the Leviathan, to see what it is and how Israel uses it. Now, we already saw in Isaiah 27, the Bible describes it as this twisting and fleeing serpent, and is either a dragon or a monster, depending on your translation. But we go to Job chapter 41, and we see in those chapters this magisterial description of this Leviathan thing. Job 41:15 says its back is made of shields and rows. They are so close to each other that they cannot be separated. Sounds like the dragon Smaug in The Hobbit. You cannot penetrate its scales. Later in verse 18 of Job 41, it says it sneezes flash forth light. Yes, this thing seems to be shooting lightning bolts out of its nostrils. And the following verses tell us that Leviathan, as a symbol of evil, can breathe out fire. Job 41:19 reads, "From its mouth go flaming torches. Out of its nostrils comes smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. Its breath kindles coals and a flame comes out of its mouth." Right, and I sometimes wonder if the images of Godzilla aren't actually based on the description of this thing in a text like Job. Psalm 74 goes even further, saying the Leviathan has multiple heads. This monstrous beast, for them, for Israel, in the midst of their suffering at the hands of these empires, becomes a symbol of the death and suffering that they are experiencing. Right, the Leviathan is not, as social media might have you think, as recently as January of this year, images that you can find on Google Earth talking about something rising near Virginia. Go and search it yourself, and you'll see that people say this all the time. But that's not what Israel is thinking. For ancient Israel, they have in their mind that God was enthroned over the floodwaters, as chapter 29 of the Psalms tells us. Right? They believe that God had created order, defeated the chaos, but in moments like this that we're talking about, when the empires seem to be winning, what do they think? What do they do? The world seems to be falling apart at the seams. It's a confusing world where they, as God's people, are the ones that have no political power. They are suffering. And Leviathan gives them a way to put a face on evil in the world and eventually to exorcise it. I think here we could again think of these typical Hollywood movies. These monster movies, as Beale says, they serve as a script for a public rite of exorcism in which that looming sense of unease is projected in the form of a monster and then blown away. In the end, the monster will be vanquished and we will be safe once again. This is exactly what we see in Psalm 74. The focus is not on the origins of evil again, but on the defeat of it. The focus is on the end of evil for all time. Psalm 74, verse 13 and 14 read, "You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness." Right? Psalm 74 reminds us that God is the vanquisher of evil, of chaos, and of that we can absolutely trust. But if we come back to Isaiah 27, it doesn't say the same thing. We note that it says, not that God crushed the heads of Leviathan in the past, but it says on that day, meaning in a sense, this is a future-oriented event, recognizing that the ultimate defeat of evil and death is still not yet. In a sense, it's saying the Leviathan is still with us. And we might wonder, well, how can Psalm 74 say Leviathan was crushed in the past and Isaiah 27:1 say that it will happen in the future? Maybe again, you think of it like these monster movies. Go back and watch all of the Godzilla movies. It'll take you a few days to watch all 33. But how many times did Godzilla die? At least 4. And by some counts, it was up to 7 times. Like in our movies, no matter how many times we might kill our monsters, they just keep coming back. Right? It's not only Dracula that is undead, but there's a sense in which all of our monsters are undead. No matter how many times we blow them up or send them to outer space, they just keep coming back. And that's certainly what Godzilla did. Like, think of it. Every generation has a new fear. Every generation needs to exercise that fear. And so in a sense, Godzilla gives them a chance to do that. And it's similar, yet different with what we're talking about today. Psalm 74 says that God killed the Leviathan in the past, but Isaiah 27:1 says God on that day will crush Leviathan. Like, this gets us into our eschatological discussions, our discussion of the end times. There is a sense in which God absolutely has defeated all evil, but there's a sense in which we live in a world where death still exists. Leviathan, in a sense, is still with us. But we know and we can trust, based on a passage like this, that God has all under control. That on that day, there will be no more Godzilla movies. Unlike in our culture, the Bible specifically says it ends once and for all. That God has all under control, that God will overwhelm all of our fears. So the defeat of Leviathan then is this hopeful message. This monster, which in the Bible represents every power asserted against God, will fall. It's a text that no doubt points forward in a lot of ways to the book of Revelation. Revelation 12:9 talks about the defeat of the dragon. And it seems like Isaiah 27 is in some sense building on this. It says there, that great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. And there's no doubt that Revelation picks up on this Leviathan theme and carries it forward to its ultimate end. Now, as we come towards and closer to a conclusion, and we want to reflect on the place of a text like this in the whole of the Bible, I do hope you can see that a text like Isaiah 27:1 gives us an image of God coming to defeat evil through killing this dragon monster. And that defeat, as we see in Isaiah 27:1, comes through the sword. But I urge you to remember that this is a symbolic image. This violent defeat made sense for ancient Israel's context, and even for the Roman context of the book of Revelation, when these empires were crushing and defeating them. It made sense in that context of warfare to think about the sword, that they were being crushed by this massive Leviathan-like empires. But as we think about the ultimate biblical story, we think about the ultimate defeat of evil. The image given isn't one of victory over evil through slaughter. That certainly isn't the full biblical picture. If it were, it'd be a bit scary for us. Because as we think about God coming back to defeat evil once and for all, we have to recognize our part in this. This reality that sometimes we as humans engage in sin. We engage in acts that harm and oppress other people. And if God comes back to defeat all evil with the sword, what does that mean for us? Does it mean that we go back to a story like the flood story in Genesis 6-9, where God comes and brings the floodwaters, the chaos back onto the earth to rid the world of human evil. It's a bit of a warning for us, and we have to ask ourselves, are we sometimes acting like these monsters? I think these movies, in a sense, explore that as well. Even the book Frankenstein is exploring this question of who is the monster. Is it the monster? Or is it the scientist who creates Frankenstein? Or take Jurassic Park. You're looking and you're watching a movie of these monstrous beasts coming to eat humans even as they sit on toilets. But then you see behind the scenes into the lab and you wonder, who are the monsters there? Or take biblical stories. David, the monster slayer, very literally. Who after that story becomes, in a sense, monstrous himself as he takes and rapes and kills after that moment. So if the image is one of, the full biblical picture is the image of one God coming to defeat sin and evil, then we have to take a look at our own lives. But the reality is it's not the full biblical picture. The New Testament then moves from the symbolic image of the defeat of Leviathan to a real image of Jesus coming to earth to deal not with us with a sword, but to give his life. The life, death, the resurrection of Jesus, I think they no doubt pick up on these themes. But Jesus, again, doesn't come to defeat the monster of evil, of sin, and more specifically of death with the sword. He comes to defeat it by self-sacrifice, by giving his life. Right? Yes, he comes, he heals, he casts out demons, he forgives sins, he raises from the dead, and he conquers death as he rises from the grave. Like, this is what Jesus is doing. Remarkably, as you go back to Isaiah 24 to 27, as it built up to the discussion of the defeat of the Leviathan, it actually focused quite extensively on death, this question of death needing to be defeated. Isaiah 25 to 20, verses 7 and 8, they talk about this. They read there, "And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples. The veil that is spread over all nations, he will swallow up death forever. And the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces." Right, death in Isaiah 25 is depicted as this veil that suffocates all peoples. But instead of death swallowing up all of us, God swallows up death. Then in Isaiah 26:19, the beginning of the passage we read for today, it focuses on resurrection. "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust awake and sing for joy." And then the culmination of this defeat of death comes in Isaiah 27:1, where God does defeat the ultimate symbol of evil and death. And there's no doubt that the New Testament picks up this symbolic image and makes it real as Jesus comes to earth to defeat this monster of evil, sin, and death. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is actually quoting from Isaiah chapter 25 in 1 Corinthians 15:54. He says, "Then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory." And in that same chapter, Paul says, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Now again, in contrast to what we read in Isaiah 27:1 about God slaughtering Leviathan with a sword, right? Jesus conquers sin and evil and the greatest enemy of death, not with a sword, but through, again, self-sacrifice. Jesus willingly goes into death and he comes out the other side as he rises from the dead. And so I think we must remember this image that Jesus leaves us with, that he invites us then into, as he wants us to participate in the defeat of evil in the world itself. And Jesus gives us the power to do so. As he leaves and he goes to heaven, he says, "I'm going to send the Holy Spirit to you." And I think this is exactly what 1 John 4, the image I want to leave you with as we think about this passage, as we think about what Jesus has come to do. He wants to show us the way forward and empower us to be part of this process. 1 John 4 talks about this power in us being greater than that in the world. And I wonder, is that talking about what it's giving us as this image in the Old Testament of a monster? And so I leave you with that verse from 1 John chapter 4. "Greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world." And so I ask you to remember that as you depart today.